Hi Year 12s. Today we're going to be looking at cellular respiration and how we use energy inside of cells. This will correlate with Unit 2.2 in your textbook. This PowerPoint will be split over 2 videos this week, so there'll be 2 videos. This is the first of the 2 videos. First video looking at just the reactions like aerobic respiration, anaerobic respiration, and our second video we're looking at ATP reactions. So how do we create ATP, where do we store ATP, how do we decompose and synthesize ATP, etc. Let's start looking at cellular respiration though. As the same as last week, we have our need to know. So these need to knows are your scientific understandings from the SACE curriculum. If you go to the subject guide, you'll see that there's some scientific understandings all down the side. These are the understandings that will be covered in this PowerPoint. Now, when possible, I've tried to make sure that the title is actually the title of the slide, but sometimes that didn't quite work because the understanding was too long. So, distinguishing between autotrophs and heterotrophs. So first off, we need to know there's 2 different types of organisms. We have autotrophs and heterotrophs. Now, no matter what type of organism you are, energy is required in order to help maintain those life processes as detailed in Mrs. Gren. So movement, respiration, synthesis, growth, reproduction, excretion, and nutrition. There's also Mr. Shen, which we can also talk about, but Mrs. Gren is fine for now. So, energy is required for all living things to make sure that they can do the requirements of Mrs. Gren. 2 types of organisms. We have autotrophs and heterotrophs. Now, autotroph, you can sort of determine what it's doing by its name. So, auto meaning self, and troph meaning nourish. So basically, this is an organism that's self-nourishing. It's creating all of its own food through processes like photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. It's creating its own energy-rich molecules. Whereas a heterotroph, again, the name tells us what we should be looking at. Heterotrophs, hetero meaning different, and troph meaning nourish, again. So we're obtaining nourishment from a different organism. These organisms obtain all of their energy by consuming other organisms. They can't create their own energy-rich molecules. They need to eat another organism in order to obtain them. So our next understanding is that the sun is the main source of energy on life. So in order to understand that, we need to understand that all energy comes from the sun. So the sun shines its light down onto our plants, as plants are using those for photosynthesis, and they're creating glucose-rich molecules through photosynthesis. Now, those glucose-rich molecules were then stored in their body or used up for energy when they're needed in aerobic respiration. But if they're stored in their body, when another organism, a heterotroph, comes along and eats that organism, it obtains those glucose-rich molecules from that organism and can use them to then provide its own energy. So really, all energy in an entire ecosystem comes from the sun. That is the start of all energy in the food chain. How does photosynthesis work though? So most plants on Earth have green cells in them, and those green cells are able to convert light energy into chemical energy. Those cells are called mesophyll cells. Now, mesophyll cells contain chloroplasts, which is an organelle which contains a chemical called chlorophyll. Now, these cells are generally found in the leaves of plants because though the leaves of a plant have the largest surface area of any part of that plant. That means that the chloroplasts in that leaf will emit the maximum amount of light, because there's a lot greater surface area, more chance of light landing on there, more chance of that light being converted into chemical energy. For now, I'm going to tell you photosynthesis is an anabolic reaction, and we will look at anabolic reactions in a later video in this PowerPoint. But photosynthesis is an anabolic reaction that creates glucose, which is an energy-rich molecule that can be broken down later on to provide energy for the cell. As a Year 12 student, it is required that you know the photosynthesis chemical equation. So carbon dioxide plus water gives us glucose and oxygen. It's also important that we note at this point that reaction here, carbon dioxide plus water and glucose plus oxygen, that's a simplified version of the equation. So truthfully, photosynthesis occurs in many small steps. And this equation here is the summary of those steps. So this isn't truthfully what's happening. This is just the summary or the net reaction that's occurring. It's much more complicated than just this equation. What happens once we've got that? we've created that glucose, that energy-rich molecule through photosynthesis. Well, we need to obtain the energy from it, and that's what aerobic respiration is. So aerobic respiration, again, is a catabolic reaction this time. We'll talk about that in a later video. So aerobic respiration is a catabolic reaction that breaks down glucose in the presence of oxygen to release energy for the cell to use. Now, aerobic respiration will occur in both autotrophs and heterotrophs. Like I said before, for aerobic respiration to occur, you have to have oxygen present. And you can remember that because aerobic sounds like the air. Oxygen is in the air. The equation for this, glucose plus oxygen, gives us carbon dioxide and water. Now again, this just looks like the reverse of photosynthesis. But again, this is just a net equation. There's truthfully much more to aerobic respiration than just the reverse of photosynthesis. It actually goes through processes called glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, the electron transport chain, all of these having their own independent reactions that tally up to aerobic respiration. So while this is the equation you need to know, just understand that this truthfully is just the net equations that are occurring. So once that energy has been released from glucose, we use it to produce ATP, adenosine triphosphate, from adenosine diphosphate, ADP. So we create ATP from ADP with the energy released from glucose. As I said before, aerobic respiration actually occurs in multiple stages. So we have glycolysis, which is the very first stage. That occurs in the cytoplasm of cells. You then have the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain. Now these are the final two stages of aerobic respiration, and they occur in the mitochondria. These are also the two stages that require oxygen to get energy out of them. So you don't need oxygen for glycolysis, you only need oxygen for citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain. Lastly, we're going to look at anaerobic respiration. So again, anaerobic respiration is a catabolic reaction, and we're breaking down glucose to release energy, but this time in the absence of oxygen. And remember, whenever we have the letters AN or A in front of a statement in biology, it generally means the opposite. So anaerobic, aerobic meant with oxygen, anaerobic means without oxygen. Two examples of anaerobic respiration are alcohol fermentation and lactic acid fermentation. Alcohol fermentation occurs in yeast, and its glucose is broken down without oxygen to produce carbon dioxide and ethanol. Lactic acid fermentation occurs in bacteria and animals, humans as well, so we've talked about lactic acid in year 11. The reaction for that is simply glucose breaks down to lactic acid.